Welcome to the morning show, everybody, broadcasting on Channel 9 as well as live streaming on Port Media's YouTube channel. It's easy to find if you prefer to listen that way at www.ncmhub, that's hub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon in the upper right-hand corner. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm so excited about today's guests. I've been looking forward to this all week. First, I'll be talking to history professor Micki McElya, who is a professor of history at the University of Connecticut at Storrs. She's also the author of the Pulitzer Prize nominated book, The Politics of Mourning, Death and Honor in Arlington National Cemetery. And she's going to be talking with us about the impacts of our lack of public national mourning for the massive numbers of Americans who have died from COVID-19 in just a few months. This morning's paper said 107,000, but it's always somewhat out of date, so I'm sure it's probably up or surpassed 108,000 by now. And then in the second half of the show, I'm pleased to welcome back Buddhist teacher Matthew Daniell, who is going to be talking to us about how Buddhist teachings can help us all deal with the massive amounts of uncertainty that we're all experiencing in the wake of the pandemic. But first, let's talk to Micki. Micki, first of all, just thank you for coming to the morning show and welcome. I'm just delighted to have you here. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. It's my pleasure and my honor. You came to my attention because you wrote a very impactful op-ed piece on May 15th, which seems like an eternity ago right now, for the Washington Post. And the title of the piece was Almost 90,000 Dead and No Hint of National Mourning. Are these deaths ours? You described an absence of national mourning of people who've died from COVID-19 that I'd been bothered by without really having the words to express the dismay that I'd felt. The focus on the mounting death toll, primarily as a numerical dashboard on the right-hand side of our TV screens, made it appear that these lost lives, my metaphor is like fireflies flickering out across the United States. Somehow they were nothing more than statistics. Micki, this subject of the neglect of public rituals of mourning has subsequently gotten a bit more attention, notably the list of 1,000 names on the front page of the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. But until I read your piece, really I hadn't seen anybody making these observations. What led you to decide you needed to write this column?
I too experienced incredible dismay watching the numbers grow and hearing a consistent use of metaphors of war to describe how the nation should respond to the pandemic, and how the nation was to come together and make a set of sacrifices and make a set to confront a set of difficulties around this crisis. Yet at the center of the war metaphor has always been those that we lose to battle and honoring those. And I couldn't understand, or I think I understand, but was profoundly frustrated by the absence of a recognition of the dead, and an absence of a recognition of at that point. I mean, just the fact that in the last 2+ weeks, the number has escalated so dramatically that all of the numbers in the piece are out of date at this point. That there was no common understanding that the people that we've lost belong to all Americans, belong to everyone collectively, and that we should honor and mark this tear in the fabric of our nation and this incredible loss together, and that we need that as a people, that we've confronted the difficulty in mourning and honoring individual and familial and friendship rituals around the individual deaths from COVID-19 because of stay-at-home orders and because of social distancing. But there is a collective absence that I also wanted to encourage a consideration of.
Yeah, well, and of course, the president has spoken of the nation as fighting a war against the pandemic, and of himself as a wartime president. And as you were just saying, if those who have died are our wartime fallen, they are being treated differently. Could you say a little bit more about what is customary and appropriate in how we ordinarily treat our wartime dead that's very different about the response that the COVID so-called wartime dead have been receiving?
Right, absolutely. So when we think about public mourning rituals, we have a set of official rituals that are very common. So
Yes.
we consider funereal processions, parades, national moments of silence,
Yeah.
which I think are profound ways of honoring the dead, because it's a moment that brings the entire sort of sprawling, dispersed nation, all of these people that I will never know, that you will never know, but that we're connected to through a
Yeah.
national belonging, that in that moment we are physically connected and
Mm-hmm.
emotionally connected.
Yeah.
Also thinking about the naming of the dead,
Mm-hmm.
memorial building. But then a number of these rituals are far more organic and are community-based. And
Mm-hmm.
these are when we witness notes of mourning and flowers and
Mm-hmm.
toys and stuffed animals
Yeah.
left at sites of
Yeah.
tragic violence.
Yeah.
This is political mourning. This is
Mm-hmm.
what we're witnessing right now for the
Mm-hmm.
murders of George Floyd, Breonna
Yes.
Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. This
Yeah.
is, just a couple of nights ago, there was a die-in
Mm.
in Dorchester. And that kind of political mourning is also something that I was really looking for, and it's happening now, and it
Yeah.
is being connected to the COVID losses.
Yeah.
Also because I think the critical piece of this is very much the same context that we're looking at in terms of Floyd's murder and the
Mm-hmm.
aftermath,
Yeah.
and all of the other Black people who have been murdered in this country
Yeah.
by state actors and state
Mm-hmm.
violence, or sanctioned by the state.
Yeah.
And that is that the pandemic dead are disproportionately people of color. They're
Mm-hmm.
disproportionately people who lack
Mm-hmm.
access to regular health care, the uninsured, the impoverished, immigrants and migrant
Mm-hmm.
communities, the elderly in nursing homes and state care facilities,
Mm-hmm.
that the people who predominate among the losses are the same people that we're seeing responses to the violence perpetrated by police and by state
Mm-hmm.
actors now. These things are
Yeah.
connected. This is
Yes.
structural racism and their results.
Yeah. Yeah. And Micki, how do you feel that the protests are somehow shifting our sense of who we are? You know, one of the things you talked about in your article was there's seemingly a missing sense that the COVID-19 dead are somehow not ours.
Mhm.
And for example, by contrast, after 9/11, we were attacked. And I mean, it was New York, you know, and DC, but we, all of America, identified with those losses. And after every school shooting, people speak of our children.
Right.
People identify broadly with the tragic loss of children sacrificed to the gun lobby, and yet somehow that sense of the COVID-19 dead didn't register as ours.
Right.
And I wonder, one of the things that, of course, people have been commenting on as we've been watching pretty much 24/7 coverage of the protests in cities large and small across America is the diversity of people who are showing up
Right.
to mourn the tragic death of George Floyd. And so I was curious to find out, because you reflect about these things often, do you think that that reflects some change in our ability to imagine perhaps a broader expanse of who we are and what our losses contain?
Absolutely. And I think I have incredible hope, and I am rejuvenated
Hmm.
by the protests that
Uh-huh.
we're seeing and that we have seen for the last week, and by the coming together of young and old, and and the danger of coming together in
Yeah.
this moment in a pandemic. And
Hmm.
so I think that we're watching people make sacrifices as
Hmm.
they choose to go to the common and represent resistance to structural racism, and
Hmm.
represent resistance to police violence
Hmm.
and mass incarceration in this country. I think it's important to remember that we didn't have a national collective, this is our child, when Trayvon Martin was murdered.
Yes.
And we see
Right.
consistently who gets
Right.
to be a part of that whole, and
Hmm.
the us that we value and, sort of collectively, and who doesn't. And so often that has consistently been drawn along lines of race.
Yeah.
And also thinking about the wider context there of the intersecting inequalities around economic inequality, class inequality, sexual inequality, gender expression. All of these things represent sort of a set of people who are so vital to this country and who are so vital to their communities, who aren't grieved collectively in the same way because they're not seen as valuable by the dominant culture. And I think that seeing so many white people, frankly, at protests right now, I think is profoundly hopeful. In part, it is people who are acknowledging their privilege, acknowledging the need to reject the privilege that comes with white supremacy. If we don't talk about these things, if we don't claim Floyd as everyone's, we continue to reproduce these things. Although I think we have to be cautious also, right? That there's also a tendency to assume that white privilege has at its core a tendency to sort of claim everything, right? And so I think that it's really important, and this has been a consistent sort of, particularly on social media, consistent line, is that also the white people who are expressing their desire to be accomplices in change or allies in change need to accept the leadership of others and need to step back and do the work, but not try to claim the glory.
You know, it's interesting. There's in this morning's Washington Post, I love the Washington Post. I subscribe to it and read it every day. But I'm glad I did, because that's how I found you, Micki. So Molly Roberts has an op-ed column. I may get the title wrong, but it's something to the effect of, this is a time for white people to shut up and listen. So what you're saying reminded me of that. She makes a point well in her article that sometimes when you think you need to go on social media to participate, you just wind up cluttering the message board, and then the other voices don't get through. So I was curious, though, about the role of statistics in mourning the COVID dead, because that is to me, it seems like a distinct phenomenon on its own. And without national mourning and the naming of the dead, as you've been talking about, what we're left with are statistics. I don't remember where I read it recently, but someone said they thought it was Joseph Stalin who had said, one death is a tragedy, 10,000 deaths are our statistic. And consider the source, but I thought that was onto something there. There was another article in the Washington Post within the last 2 weeks about the galactically high number of hits that the Johns Hopkins death dashboard gets online every day. My jaw almost literally dropped. 4 billion hits every day. And the reporter writing the story referred to checking the dashboard numbers as something of a proxy for flag-draped coffins of other kinds of war. And one researcher who was checking the dashboard every day that Craig Timborg interviewed described monitoring the daily increase of the dead as a way to, this was the expression he used, bear witness to the anonymity of the dead, which struck me as strange and poignant at the same time. It also, of course, bears witness to the outsized death toll in the United States from COVID-19 compared to other nations. Now, Micki, you're an historian of mourning. Is this response to the pandemic dead and historic outlier? The focus on statistics, have there been precedents? How can we understand what this reflects about our nation?
There's a comparison to be made to earlier pandemics where we have similarly seen, and historians both of medicine, but historians of public ritual and patriotism and nation building have pondered and puzzled over the absence of a significant memorialization of the 1918 flu and the losses there, which were massive. Or thinking of the 1957-58 pandemic, or the 1968 pandemic, both of which are in the lived memory of so many people still, that I didn't know had happened until this moment. And I was reading about comparisons. I'm a historian of the post-Civil War United States up to the present day, but I really focus, much of my work now, my current research is post-World War II. How did I miss that? Or how did I miss hearing about it from my family? And so I think that there's a there's an important comparison there where
Mm-hmm.
an enormous amount is revealed in this moment, and much
Yeah.
of it is problematic and painful to
Mm-hmm.
consider. But there is a similarity in
Mm-hmm.
to, I don't know if it's an inability to digest the
Mm.
numbers, if it's
Yeah.
an inability to recognize in a way that's so clear to us right now that illness is, while illness affects everybody, is a
Yes.
human problem, it capitalizes on conditions, and the
Mm-hmm.
conditions of structural racism and limited access to healthcare and impoverishment in this country
Yeah.
produce disproportionate outcomes of infection.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been true in the past as well.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for a long time, we've sort of thought about these as well, that it's a natural occurrence that happens. How do we talk about that as
Yeah.
being like a war?
Yeah.
But also, how do we process 107,000 plus people gone in
Yeah.
less than 3 months?
Yeah.
This is, and gone in so many cases so needlessly. And I think
Yeah.
the crux of the issue there is
Mm-hmm.
that the enormous number in the United States is a product of neglect, is a
Yeah.
product of an ineffective response or
Mm-hmm.
preparation.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the issue that our wartime president, so called,
Yeah.
is seeking to avoid in
Mm-hmm.
not marking and not recognizing the
Yeah.
dead in a
Mm-hmm.
meaningful way.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think, by another token, the other really important comparison to make here, and maybe the one that I think is most effective in highlighting the issues, is to the HIV/AIDS pandemic and
Yes. Yeah.
to official and community responses
Mm-hmm.
in the 1980s up to the present moment, in terms of
Yeah.
how both medical and political responses to public health vis-a-vis HIV and
Mm-hmm.
AIDS have shifted over time. Um, I think that it highlights that we all bear responsibility
Mm-hmm.
for these
Yeah.
things. I think it's very easy to focus on the executive and President Trump in
Mm-hmm.
this moment as being the source of the problem,
Yeah.
but it's wider than that. And it
Yeah.
requires some hard self-reflection on the
Mm-hmm.
part of many.
Absolutely.
As this
And
moment, as protesters are encouraging us,
yes,
in
they
other,
are, and they're succeeding.
yes.
So which is really good. Well, I also wanted to talk some about expressions of national public mourning that have been transformative, have supplied a nation with something that was needed. And in your article, you cite some extraordinary expressions of grief that, in fact, were moments that met that national need and transformed a solitary loss into a unifying collective grief. And it's a great contrast to what we're missing now, I think, and what a different kind of leadership at every level might be able to provide. And one of them had to do with Winston Churchill. And I have to say that I think Netflix's series, The Crown, has helped a lot of Americans understand how much Winston Churchill meant to the British people, to help them get through, to galvanize them through that very, very difficult war when, no one knew how it was going to turn out. And so we understand better why his loss was keenly felt. But in your article, you share a very moving passage from the English poet Laurie Lee. From it's called "Lying in State." And Micki, I was so moved by it. I was hoping that you would share that passage with us.
Oh, sure. It is a moving, gorgeous, gorgeous set of lines. Lee writes, "Every resounding event seems to be followed by silence as history catches its breath.
Mm-hmm.
So it is this morning in this great bare hall, a silence like a fall of snow, holding the city and the world in a moment of profound reflection, reducing all men to a leveled pause."
Those two phrases, "history catches its breath," um, it makes me pause
Mhm.
and breathe. And the phrase "the level pause" is also, it helps you understand what does happen in moments like that. But what is the importance, Micki, of the level pause, of history catching its breath, and what happens when we don't have that opportunity?
I think it's a profoundly important moment for a community, for a nation, to come together and feel a common cause and feel a common comfort in
Mm-hmm.
marking the loss of either people who are deeply important to the country, mass losses, or individual leaders like Winston Churchill. And even sort of individual leaders like Winston Churchill, who is also a complicated figure. There are lots of people in the world who would not look to Churchill as a hero, but as a criminal, you know? And so we have to sort of think about, but that gets produced in these moments. And that's what I think is so beautiful and important, but also something to be critical of and to be mindful of, that the good feelings and the comfort that is produced and the care that is produced in those moments can also be the things that drive violent actions in the future, or that could drive revenge, could drive other things. And so it isn't always, it's never easy. But I also think that it's to not, people have spoken very eloquently about individual losses and the traumas compounded in this moment for individuals and for communities and families. And many have noted that things repressed never go away.
That's right.
And I think that we are seeing the attempted repression of the racial and class realities of this country burst forward in a really productive way this week. I think we will also see the consequences of not honoring these who are lost. And I don't want to say, the New York Times front page, I think, was a beautiful and resonant with war memorialization, right? So the listing of the names. The New York Times used to list names during the Civil War of the dead. It was, you know, and the listing of names as a way to individuate losses, I think is incredibly important. And there has been work. Monday, there was a national day of mourning and lament called by faith leaders across the country. It's hard for these things to lift to the surface. I'm not sure how many nationwide know that these things are happening. They seem very community-based, but they are happening, and people are doing that good work.
And maybe over time, they will have the opportunity to rise to the surface. We have such busy news cycles now each week. You can't imagine what is going to happen, you know, within the next few days. But I did want to ask you about Arlington National Cemetery. You wrote a whole book about it. And part of what you talk about is that the United States it may have a more intense need for national mourning because we're such a big, diverse, and fractious nation, and therefore we may need it more powerfully than smaller nations. You reminded us of Lincoln's phrase when he was delivering his first inaugural address. That Lincoln, boy, what a poet. He talked about the mystic chords of memory, ties that stretch from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land. So collective grief appears to be the living, breathing soul of national memory, and nothing symbolizes this more than Arlington National Cemetery. So you did write a whole book about it, so it's probably unfair to ask you to comment in a couple of paragraphs about it, but maybe you'll bear with me. I just wondered if you could say a little bit about why a military graveyard became our most revered patriotic site.
Absolutely. Well, and the history itself of how it became that site is in many ways the condensed history of this country, of its founding, its glorious promise, and the wonder of the American promise, and the terrible parts of it all come together in that place. And I looked to work on I wanted to write the book because I was astounded to discover, even though I understood, and people who travel through the cemetery likely know that it was Robert E. Lee's plantation on the eve of the Civil War, and there is an enormous plantation house that sits in the middle. But what I didn't understand was really how that space had been used during the Civil War and after, and how long it took to become the national shrine that it is today. And really, that emerges at the turn of the last century, and in the context of the passing of the generation of the Civil War leaders, and the embarking of overseas empire and battle in the Philippines and Cuba in the Spanish-American War at the turn of the century. And so seeing that space as a space that is a site of slavery and a history of slavery and a history of that plantation, and then as a site for formerly enslaved people who were running to Washington, who were running to Northern Virginia, who were fleeing enslavement, who were freeing themselves in the context of the war. It became a site where the military sought to move those folks out of DC and put them in what was called a contraband camp called Freedmen's Village. And for a long time, that was the largest use of the land. The cemetery itself was quite small at the beginning and grew because it became the place that the Army brought the dead from all across Virginia, Maryland, in this massive, and when we think about sort of federal responses, when we think about military responses to losses, the collection and identification and bringing together of the Civil War dead, the Union dead, important to note, to bringing them together was sanctifying that ground as a site of military honor, and is a part of the beginning of the national cemetery system, which is in part designed to ensure that veterans get an honorable and a good death, no matter what their circumstances. It's to ensure that they don't end up ungrieved, that they don't end up, should they be in those circumstances, at a place like Hart Island, which has become familiar to people in the context of this pandemic.
Well, Micki, I'm reading your book right now, and I recommend it to everybody. It's a fascinating story, and it does kind of, it's kind of like a macrocosm. The story of Arlington National Cemetery has almost all of American history in it. So thank you for writing that. I shared with you that both of my parents were Army veterans during World War II, and they're both buried there. And I have to say that, you know, the military funerals that they got and visiting their grave sites there, it feels commensurate to the loss. And I think that's what you were talking about, a place that would feel commensurate to the dedication that people have shown to their country, that creates a kind of well, it engenders a patriotic feeling. So, Micki, I can't end without asking you. You're an historian and a writer, and you must be writing something now. You just mentioned something about post-World War II. What are you working on these days?
I am currently working on a book called No More Miss America, How Protesting the 1968 Pageant Changed a Nation. And it looks at the 1968 Miss America pageant and women's liberation protests at the pageant, which many people are familiar with. People are less familiar with the fact that it was also the site of another protest in the form of a pageant, was the first Miss Black America pageant, and which was designed to counter and to challenge the racism of the organization and the fact that they had never had a Black finalist at that time. And so in ways that are somewhat similar to Arlington, I see in that moment and in that set of protests, but also in the histories of the women and the organization who are connected to Miss America and to the pageant. A political story and a condensing of a time period that will allow us to see both women who aren't often recognized in the context of political histories in this country, and also lets us see a variety of places coming together. So it covers a range of Phyllis Schlafly and Anita Bryant, who was a finalist, although never Miss America, to Robin Morgan, Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, and Sandra Williams, who was the first Miss Black America in 1960.
Micki, that sounds amazing. May I ask you how close you are to finishing?
I submitted in 2 years, so not close, but close-ish.
Okay. Well, consider yourself pre-booked for the morning show. You have to come back and tell us about that. That sounds really fascinating. I don't know how to thank you enough for coming on the show and talking to us about these important issues, Micki. It was a real honor and a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, the honor is all mine. It's been
Uh,
so fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Um, well, everybody, we are now going to shift, and I am going to welcome Buddhist teacher Matthew Daniell to the morning show. And Matthew is going to talk to us about Buddhist teachings about uncertainty. Matthew is the Buddhist teacher at the Insight Meditation Center of Newburyport. He's a friend of the morning show. He's been on in the past, and I read a very fascinating column that he wrote for the Daily News a few weeks ago about aligning with change. And I thought that that was an excellent topic and was moved to invite him to come back and talk to us about how to deal with uncertainty. And I believe Matthew is connecting right now with us and should be here any second now. So, Matthew, can you hear me? I can't hear you, Matthew. Is your audio off?
It is.
There you go. Now I hear you. Welcome back, Matthew. I love the background.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, I've been wanting to talk to you since I read your column about dealing with uncertainty, because we have so much of it these days, and the news is full of it. There's so much speculation I find as I read the news. Will the pandemic ever end? Will we work from home forever? Will school ever start again? What kind of books will we write someday about what we're experiencing now? Will there ever be a vaccine? Will people refuse to take the vaccine? Will the protests lead to real change? There's so much uncertainty and so much anxiety that goes along with it. And it often appears to me, Matthew, as though the more we speculate about what might happen, the more we uncover what we can't possibly know about what might happen. And that makes us just more anxious. So why is it, Matthew, you think we keep trying to predict what's going to happen, even when it makes us worry and feel fretful?
Well, I think at core, it's a really basic human instinct to really long for security.
Mm-hmm.
When things are good, we want them to stay that way. And when we change and we're attached to the way they are, then we kind of can suffer from that. And we don't like that feeling. It's very unpleasant.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And in the same way, when things are very unsteady as they are now, as with so many conditions changing, it can really be a place of comfort to project in the future. Mm-hmm. And that we get some satisfaction by dwelling in the possibilities, but then it's not real. It doesn't give us a place to live because there's a giant we don't know.
Right.
There's a giant unknown out here. But it's a natural human instinct to want to find security when there actually isn't the kind of security in the outer expressions of life that we want there to be. So it's just natural. I think it's fascinating to watch all of it.
Yes.
And I think it's very healthy as well to stay with, if we have an inquiring mind, to stay with what is actually happening in terms of data and in terms of, and then also holding the human element deeply, and being able to have the skills and the natural empathy to really to be with the fullness of this moment in human history.
Yeah.
But in a way where we make the choice when we're looking for security to realize, maybe that's not the best place to put my, maybe that's not the best place to try to place my security is through wanting this mind to land on something, and we just don't know.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I know all of us on our own experience can look at times when we just kind of go, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? I need to know. And you're right. It couldn't be more human to do that. But then you arrive at the point where you go, oh, I could be completely wrong, or kind of like nobody knows. And then at the end of that cloud, there's kind of a fall off into, well, wait, no, I have to come back to the present where I don't know what's going to happen, because that's the reality for all of us. So you put that very well, Matthew, and very sympathetically. Thank you for that. So what does Buddhism have to teach us about dealing with the anxiety of uncertainty?
Well, first of all, there's the core of the whole teachings of Buddhism is that when we explore the nature of experience, both inside ourselves, our bodies, our minds, and the outer world, it's constantly changing. It's always in flux.
Mm-hmm.
And there are ways that the teachings of the Buddha, and particularly the meditation techniques of learning to come and be in the present moment through mindfulness of how things are, there's a grounding quality in that.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're grounded not in the changing flow of experience. We're grounded in the fact that we're present to it, that we're here. So we learn to come back to a breath, to a footstep. We learn to pay attention to somebody else or our own inner reactions, and we're here. And so we learn to realign where we're trying to find refuge, confidence, rest, nourishment from trying to, all these changing conditions. And it's not just they're changing, but they're changing in unpredictable ways.
Yes.
So one of my teachers in Thailand, Ajahn Chah, a famous Thai monk, used to say, not sure, all the time. And that was meant to be actually something that helps to realign ourselves in a way that we actually find more peace. Well, what? So we do it, one, by grounding and steadying in very simple things in the present, realizing, oh, there's a quality of being present that isn't based on the changing conditions, right?
Right, yes.
So you align, so there's an alignment. So you align, so then we align ourselves with things that are often more predictable. So we align ourselves and we tune into qualities like we're sitting, and a lot of the meditations are done, or a basic meditation is sitting and breathing. What are we doing? Every breath is changing, right? They're changing in subtly different ways, deep, shallow, rough, smooth. And we learn just to, when our mind gets caught up in all this perseverating and all this future, getting caught in possibilities of the future that we don't know, or getting caught in the past of how it was and comparing mind or how it should be, right? This future and past and should be and shouldn't. We learn to rest on this changing experience. And then slowly through that, and this is really the power of mindfulness, is that we start to calm down a little bit. We start to get a little bit settled, and we can do it with the breath. We can do it with the rhythms in our life. We can do it with going for a simple walk and just feeling. So we're aligning ourselves with change in these ways. So we start to nourish ourselves, our hearts and our mind. And then this gives us the skill to change our relationship to all the ways that things are changing in unpredictable ways, and all the difficult emotions that come up. So one basic frame of positivity, which I really like, there's a story of this same teacher, Ajahn Chah. He was a monk, so they didn't have many things, but he had one tea mug or teacup that he really loved. And he had a novice that would clean his little earthen kuti, little place where he'd stay and meditate. And one day he came in and he broke it when Ajahn Chah wasn't there. And Ajahn Chah came back, and the novice was like, oh no, he's going to be really upset. And he saw the broken cup, and Ajahn Chah wasn't upset. And he said, well, of course I'm not upset. I've been living with appreciation for that mug because one day I knew it would break. So it's actually, so we know, so that's how, and that's a really great lesson for relationships, for our bodies, for our life, that, oh, this too will change. And because it's changing, and it's going to change, because of that, we can bring more full care and attention and real love into how we're living, rather than get caught up in the fear and anxiety. Right? So they're both poles. One, you can do a positive reframing, right? Appreciating what's here because it's impermanent. And also through the strength of being present, nourishing ourselves in very simple, systematic ways we can train, then we can open up and have a wider ability just to hold with more care, more kindness, more clarity. All these changes and all the natural human emotions that, especially in a time like this, are very, very difficult.
That's a great story. I love that story about the teacup, because it kind of, it enables you to see that impermanence, rather being something that we suffer from, can also be a condition of being able to learn how to truly appreciate and value, because it brings us into touch with the fundamental reality of our human condition, which is constant change. But I also, Matthew, I love the way you talk about restoring ourselves to the breath in the present moment as an antidote to instinctively, I think, as we were saying before, when we have uncertainty, our first instinct can be to speculate, to try and reassure ourselves, will this happen, will that happen? But there's no there there. There's nothing when you go there. There's no there there. That's what Gertrude Stein famously said of Oakland, California, that there was no there there. So there's no there there, and so it actually generates more anxiety, and it doesn't always. Once we're in that anxious mindset, though, it doesn't always occur to us to do what you're suggesting, which is simply breathe yourself back, step on the ground in front of you, or the breath in front of you, in and out, and you are actually surviving change as you breathe. And so that's the simplicity of it is beautiful and transformative, even though the tricky part is remembering to do that, isn't it?
Well, actually, there's even a more simple frame than using it. It is, mindfulness, being present it's not difficult. It's actually very simple. But it's difficult to do just because it's not a habit energy.
Yeah, that's a good habit energy. I like that phrase.
So we're trying, because our habit energies are getting caught up in anxiety, in fear of the unknown, in grasping for security, in fantasies, which themselves don't last. If the fantasy lasted, then we could find security there, but those change too. And so then we're often, if we live in this either anxiety or positive wishful thinking, and then when that bubble breaks, we're back to how it actually is, that can even be more painful.
Yeah.
So we're learning to just tune in so we can use techniques. So the more we do it, and we have to learn to do it in a way that's gentle and steady. So rather than forcing, I've got to get to the breath and trying to push away anxiety. No, we let the anxiety be there, but we just nourish ourselves. Okay. So you do that in particular ways you can train, but also you can do it by just relaxing your attention and just opening up into the moment as it is. Just, what am I present to now? What is present? And then you relax into simply being aware. Because every moment's experience, there's what we're experiencing and there's awareness, right? We wouldn't be experiencing the anxiety if there wasn't an awareness of the anxiety. And in the same way, the trees, this is a beautiful time of year to actually align ourselves with the movement of change in the seasons, which have their own powerful integrity. Right? And just keep moving. So we can do that. We can do it training, but we can also do it in a very natural way where we just relax and we open. And we recognize that awareness is a natural function of being alive. And that's deeply empowering.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Right? It's just, and it can't be taken out of the fabric of being human. All these other things come in color and we struggle. And then in moments, we're just here.
Right.
So we just learn to recognize that. And then we train that capacity by choosing certain aspects of experience to come back to. And then once that's stronger, then we can start to see into the changing nature in a way where we can actually learn from it. So difficulties can actually be places of learning if we're curious, but we need enough strength and enough open-heartedness to make that shift. And and sometimes that can't happen. We get overwhelmed. Then we really need to retreat, right? Take some time alone, take care of our bodies, make sure we're doing all these things in life now. And do some formal present moment awareness, mindfulness practice can be really helpful, as well as doing practices of kindness, of intentionality, of goodwill for ourselves and others. That can be really helpful too, especially in these difficult times.
Absolutely. Oh, you put that so beautifully. I feel calmer just listening to you. In the article, you told a story that I loved a lot, and I'm going to ask you to tell it now for us again. It's a story about told by Thich Nhat Hanh, the well-known late Buddhist teacher, Vietnamese Buddhist teacher and author, and it's about rickety boats full of refugees taking perilous journeys to Thailand, and some of them make it and some don't. And what's really powerful about the story is the difference between the boats that make it and the ones that don't. Would you share that story with us, Matthew?
Sure. So you've already given most of the story, but you didn't give,
sorry.
You didn't give the punchline, though. You didn't give the punchline. So
no, I saved it for you.
So what I understand is that this wonderful Zen master, Thich Nhat Hanh from Vietnam, and actually just a little backdrop on him, it's very interesting because during the Vietnam War, there was the communists and the capitalists that were fighting each other. And he started a third movement. He's a very popular teacher of mindfulness and said, look, we're gonna practice peace in the midst of these opposites. And what happened was neither side liked it and he got kicked out. So he started, it's quite logically actually, and he started a center in southern France called Plum Village. It's still going now, and I had the good fortune of being there for a summer where you had hundreds of people from all over the world, and you do simple mindfulness of eating and walking and breathing, and it's just wonderful for whole families and everything. So he's been involved with this inner peace movement, right?
Yeah.
The foundations for outer peace for a long time, and through many, many very difficult cultural situations. And so there were these people during the Vietnam War. They were refugees. And they would try to get away from the fighting by getting on these boats that often weren't in very good shape, and they try to make it through the open seas to Thailand in safety. And he learned later that a lot of the boats didn't make it, and on a lot of the boats that did make it, there was at least one person who had real depth of calm.
Mm. Yeah.
So what does this mean, and how is this applying? Well, on the boat, if you're on a boat and everyone's freaking out, the outer conditions are very choppy, and then people start getting anxiety and worry, and what do we do? And there's very little that can be done. So there are definitely parallels to how many of us may feel now. That Thich Nhat Hanh, they discovered that these people that were trained in being present, deeply present, could sit on the boat, and many of them were trained in mindfulness, sitting and breathing, and being steady, going with these flow of change, relaxing, touching calm on the inside. And then allowing that calm, because they're engaged, they're with the other people on the boat, that simple calm could be an emotional, like we have these, we're called social neurons, where we're communicating with each other, even though it's oftentimes not verbal. So it's like people that have a peaceful energy can affect those around, and the same thing with anxiety. So someone with that peaceful quality, because they learn to touch nourishment in the midst of chaos, in the midst of change, through aligning with change. So then that had impacts in just being present. And also, if you're more present and steady and also open, then if something needs to be done on the boat, you can do it.
Yeah.
You need to change the ballast, or people need to go to the left or the right, you won't be freaking out. You'll make better judgments and decisions. Yeah. So he loves to tell this story, that if there's at least one calm person, and many of these people had formal training in this, that it really can have an effect on both one's own well-being and then all the community around one. Right?
Yeah, I love that story. I love the idea of the one calm person having a transformative effect, not only on their own mind, but being a resource for the whole group. Because none of us make good decisions when we're agitated or afraid. And so calm and the kind of the neurologically the mirror neurons that you were referencing, where we empathically do pick up on other states of mind. So it's a superpower. and just to draw on that idea a little, what I like about the story is that calm appears in not just as a state of mind, but as what I would call a real strength. And although viewing calm as a fundamental resource in a time of crisis may be a little bit against the grain in our culture, American culture, it really is fundamental, as the story illustrates, to making wise decisions. And therefore, it strikes me that it's an important civic virtue to cultivate, as well as a personal one. And I wonder what your thoughts are, Matthew, about how we can cultivate the value of calm in our community leaders and decision makers.
So this is a little tricky, because from a Buddhist point of view, the fundamental way that change happens is from the inside out. Okay, so the Dalai Lama is he says, the leader of one of the major Tibetan schools, he says peace starts with each one of us. And so it starts with each one of us, and that means me. So just understanding that if I try to impose that person needs to be peaceful, it's starting with me needing others to be different than me for peace to be cultivated, and that's why it's tricky, right? So Thich Nhat Hanh also said, and this is a real faith in the power of being present. and compassion. So there's two wings, there's wisdom and compassion. So compassion does express itself in the form of action. It's inner in how we relate to emotions, but it's also outer in how we relate to difficult situations in the world, right? So he says, if you want peace in body, this is interesting, goes all the levels, in our bodies, start with the mind. So start with how we're using our attention and the decisions we're making. If you want peace in the body, start with the mind. In the family, start with yourself. So that's your fullness of who you are. Community, start with family. So you need to be that person on the boat in your family. And then your family, community, starts with the family. So that's the people that you are part of, right? Peace workers. We're peace workers in a way, right?
Right, that's right. I love that.
Yeah, so we connect with others. And then world starts with community.
Yeah. So it's like those Russian stacking dolls, the Matryoshka dolls. One thing is when the inner calm leads to an outer calm that extends from family to community to world. Go ahead.
But that also doesn't mean that it doesn't mean if social action, for example, is called for. So if just very recently, if you look at some of the marches that were done, to fight, to speak against, and some of these were in silence, to speak against through silent shared community presence, the oppressions and the wrongs and things that are actually causing tremendous harm to large numbers of people, behaviors that haven't been examined, or haven't been dealt with effectively. So this is a powerful act. And so you can see that inner act changes our inner harmony with all the conditions that are inside of us. And then we can actually express that. So these communities can be of action as well. And so that is where it links up. So then that's where that links up. But the problem, if we're dealing with leaders and others, is that they have to be receptive.
Right.
So if we have natural empathy, so we can also work with empathy to understand more the conditioning of people that are making decisions that we really don't agree with at a deep level. But if they're not open, if they don't share that, then we can only do what we can do.
Right.
And then if that turns to anger or righteous indignation, because I'm taking care of myself, I'm taking care of the community, I'm practicing harmony and care. If they don't pick up on that, then we have to be really careful to just hold and be kind with the frustration and the emotions that arise within that. Because if we don't, then we become victims. Because we haven't shifted from the fundamental understanding that if I'm not peaceful here, that's not going to help. Right? So that's right. So it's that we can. That's one of the saddest things for me, is that we can become victims of our own emotions, and it doesn't change anything out there. We're hurting ourselves.
Right.
And that's not passive, because this is dynamic. This is an inner. These are inner dynamics that we have to actively work with, because our habit energies and the habit energies of the world are so strong.
Yeah.
So I hope that helps to link it just a little bit between
Absolutely.
the inner and the outer.
Absolutely. And I love that phrase, habit energy, because habits, although hard to break, once you have a new habit in place, it provides a kind of a ballast or a foundation that will can support you and launch you forward. One more question for you, Matthew, and I think as we've been talking, I know the answer to this now, but we'll see. People are continually asking the question, what will the new normal be? I'm sure you've heard that. And so, Matthew, I was going to ask you, is this a helpful question? I have the feeling, no, probably not. But I would like to pose to you just to see what it makes you think of. Is there a better question that we might all be posing for ourselves?
Well, I'll throw this back on you, and then I can also comment. But given the flavor of our conversation and the basic thrust of aligning ourselves with change to nourish ourselves through being present, and then allowing that to inform how we relate to changing conditions and unpredictably changing conditions. So what if in that frame, what would the new normal be if we were taking care of our hearts and minds? What do you think?
Well, if the new normal is a teacup, then it could be like the teacup. If it gets broken, it's a chance to remind ourselves that there never is a normal. Things are always changing. Anyway, in the first place, that's my first thought. And then the second thought is, the question is, am I breathing? Deep breath. Am I paying attention to what's happening inside me right now? And as I do that, can I follow my curiosity to what my own experience is, and then gradually expand that to the environment around me? So those are my first thoughts in response to that.
Good. And those lead to what I would say is the fundamental. What we would, if we had a goal of a new normal, it would be the normal of learning and to live from a place where our habit energies were more naturally inclined towards present moment awareness, wise empathy and compassion for ourselves and others. So the new normal wouldn't be an outer condition of normal, but it would be an inner condition where our habit energies were uprooted and changed to some extent, or we just had little glimmers, little places where we learned, oh, awareness is free. There's a sense of nourishment in the present. And then that gives us the ability to be more fully with how our life actually is, responding as skillfully. So we learn to move from a kind of reactivity, which we get when the old habit energy is just functioning. And we have to train to be able to cut it, not reject it, but just cut the power of it when our thoughts and our emotions get really tied up. So we learn to work with that. And then when we see into that, then that gives us the new default modes can be more, oh, it's normal to be present. But we love drama. I'm just saying, it's humans, we love drama. So can we do a little both, right? Can we love the drama and also really appreciate the power of simplicity and present? Oh, it's actually, so there's, in some traditions, they say normalcy of mind. And mind means mind and heart. Right? So it's actually, you touch a normalcy, which is just a full presence. Right?
Right.
So, but that's an ideal. And we can just little bits. And I think that a lot of the stuff that you said was actually really getting to the practical points. Turn to the breath.
Great. Excellent.
Align ourselves with change. Go with the flow of an emotion. If you can hold it more skillfully and tenderly. So let me read one thing from Thich Nhat Hanh. Now, because anger has been coming up a lot for people.
Yes.
And I do an awful lot. Most of the classes from the Insight Meditation Center of Newburyport have been moved online. So we have a number of drop-in classes and also regular people, that regular classes. And what I'm noticing is that a lot of people are both frustrated and angry. And how do we work with this so that we don't become the victims and we don't perpetuate, right? This reactivity in the world. So Thich Nhat Hanh says, anger is a state of suffering. So we have to recognize that when it's in the mind. The Buddhist attitude is to take care of anger or any emotion. We don't suppress it. We don't run from it. We just breathe and hold our anger in our arms with utmost tenderness. The anger, or whatever emotion it is no longer alone. It is with mindfulness. So the anger, so often when we get caught up in emotion, so we breathe and hold our anger in our arms with utmost tenderness. The anger is no longer alone. It is with mindfulness. So this is what you were talking about as a superpower.
Yes.
That we actually have this tender, open, steady quality of being present. And this is a very concrete way if we want to practice this a little bit. Often it's good to get trained to just watching the breath by itself to get a little bit facile with the technique, right? But then also to be able to use that and then just open to life and breathe with. I'm trying to breathe through or push through or get rid of, but actually holding tenderly. It's not alone, because these emotions, the reason they get more and more intense is they actually isolate us. Right? We get caught. We get caught in the cycle of anger or resentment or frustration or fear. Fear is a huge one. You get caught, and then that self-isolates. So, and that causes more pain. So this is really holding it tenderly in our arms. It's not alone. When we're present, we're not alone. And that's within ourselves, and it's also in our communities.
Matthew, I love that. The idea of responding to anger with tenderness is just beautiful and transformative. You're such a wonderful teacher. Thank you so much for talking with us on the morning show about how to deal with uncertainty. As ever, I always learn from you. So thank you very much. I hope you'll come back again.
Great. Thanks so much for having me, Mary.
Thank you, Matthew. You take care. I really appreciate you coming to the show. I've learned a lot. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Well, everybody, that's it for today's morning show. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll join us next Thursday on the morning show when my guest will be our state senator, Diana DiZoglio, who will talk with us about impacts on Massachusetts and our district of the pandemic. And I'll also welcome Suzanne Dubus of the Geiger Center about the particular challenges that the pandemic has brought to those in danger of domestic violence and the resources available to them through the Geiger Center, as well as resources available to those who might be worrying about or fearful for them. If you missed part of today's show, it will be available for viewing on the Port Media YouTube channel playlist for the morning show at www.ncmhub.hub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday morning at 8 a.m. and then the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. And will be available then as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just click on the cloud icon at www.ncmhub.org and then scroll down. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to our producers, Tyler Neufeld and Caleb Noble, and to Port Media's Executive Director, Sarah Hayden. Also a shout out today to Richard Lodge, the editor of the Daily News, who has been so supportive helping us publicize the morning show and just in general supportive of Port Media. So thank you, Richard. Take care, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to today's show. See you next Thursday at 9 o'clock for the morning show. Bye, everybody.